This video is going to be a time lapse of an entire still life drawing where you're able to see the different techniques that we're going to be going over applied, and then the entire drawing with value change, highlights and shadows incorporated as well. So it's a great way to just see the entire process and think about the different techniques and how they're completely and fully applied into the still life. A couple of the drawing techniques that I'll be discussing while playing the time lapse is, first of all, value change. So creating accurate value change with contrast. Simple shapes. We're going to start out as simple and basic as possible before adding detail. Pencil measurements. So double check measurements and angles using your pencil. And then the last thing is flipping your reference picture upside down every once in a while to get a different viewpoint of your still life. And that's going to allow certain areas to stand out to you that are going to need adjustments and changed. So we'll go ahead through the time lapse here. So getting started, we're going to be using simple shapes and forms, and I'll pause this in a second once I have all the simple shapes applied. But don't do anything detailed yet. So I'm just outlining circles, squares, triangles as the basic shapes for all of these forms. And then as this video progresses, you'll see me slowly adding more and more detail. So we're going to start with simple shapes. And then at this point, I'm going in and measuring my simple shapes. So here I have everything laid out. I have a bunch of grapes laid out here, and then there's a vase, I have a pear, and then a few more grapes behind the vase. Everything is just simple circles and squares. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and check that I have everything lined up correctly size-wise, because I don't want to add a lot of detail and get my shading perfect and then realize the sizing or placement is off and have to erase and go back. So I'm going to be using a pencil, and I'm holding that pencil out on my object to double check proportions. So as I'm doing this here, there was let me move a little bit further back, but there was one pencil width across the height. So let's double check this. So I'm measuring about half, and then vertically it's 2.5. So moving on, once you have the measurements figured out, you may have to go in and make corrections. So I'm holding my pencil and marking where the height is on the drawing versus the picture. I'm going to go ahead and continue playing that. So I'm double checking the height and then the width of these objects, realizing I need to make this a little bit skinnier. And then I'm just quickly erasing those circles and redrawing them to line that up. If this part is throwing you off or the explanation doesn't make sense for the measurements, let me know and I can explain that a little bit better in person. But here we have the shading beginning to be added onto the pear. And I'm starting with the darkest areas first. So I'm looking at everywhere that is completely in shadow, and I'm just lightly filling those in. So I'm going to come back and add more detail later, but I want to fill in all of the shadow across the board on all of these objects first, and then we'll continue to blend things out and layer it a little bit more. So again, I'm just looking at all of those shadows, kind of outlining them a bit. Remember to check for the reflection where there might be some highlights. So I'm outlining those areas of highlight so I leave them white. And then I'm just lightly outlining everything else to get a base layer of shadow. So I'm going in, adding more shadow across here. I'm not too worried about it blending together yet, but remember, if you're using the blending technique, to use small circles. And then I do want to see you use blending, cross-hatching, and hatching in this practice. So pick some different areas to incorporate the different techniques. So on the grapes here, I'm doing more of the hatching, and this allows me to really emphasize form. So I can create more of a curve where the hatching is. And then at this point, once I have all of my base shadows in, it's going to help to kind of see areas that I can go back and refine. So I'm going to stop once I have those base shadows layered into my image, and I'm going to flip both my reference picture and my drawing upside down. So by flipping both of these upside down, I'm able to quickly look back and forth and see areas that stand out that might need to be adjusted or might be the wrong size. So again, just try to flip them both upside down every once in a while to really double check proportions. So I'm shading everything in with the white now. So I'm looking at all of the brightest highlights and I am going over those areas along with some of the medium tones or the gray areas. And this is going to help to really create that contrast. But again, I'm slowly layering things in so you don't have to cover really everything completely at this point. So I'm just lightly shading. Now I'm going back in with more shadow, so I'm going over the darkest areas again, just a little bit more, using my blending stump to start to smooth things out, especially now that I have the white in, it's going to blend together a lot better. Then I'm looking for those lightest highlights again, going over them, just trying to refine the details. And then back and forth with the white and the black to continue to push that value change and contrast. So I'm outlining those highlights, erasing the edges a little bit just to refine some of those areas. And again, I'm flipping both upside down every once in a while just to see areas that stand out that I can go in and adjust. And it does help to take focus off of the details of the object and draw more what's actually there, actually in front of you. So I'm blending things in a bit more, working on some of the grapes here, leaving those highlights white as I'm working, looking at the shadows, reflections, and drop shadow. So you can see that little bit of a highlight or reflection on the bottom of the pear. And then I'm going in with that blending stump, just smoothing things out before I continue to layer more detail. So I'm really jumping around. I'm not staying focused on one object as I'm shading, but really moving around throughout the piece so that everything is building those layers at the same time. And now I'm really going in and emphasizing the hatching method on some of these grapes. So I'm following the form of the grape as I'm adding those lines to really create more dimension in the piece. So follow the curve or the outside of the form there. Then I'm bringing the white pencil back to add some details, adding some drop shadows. I would also consider using a little scrap of paper and put that down under your hand so you're not smudging too much of your picture. So I'm putting that little piece of paper down first, and that's helping with blending and not smudging my image. So now I'm continuing to just sharpen that pencil and get some good lines with the hatching and cross-hatching around the grapes here. And you'll notice it really start to bring more dimension into the grapes. Really think about the direction that you're drawing your lines. Follow the outside form in order to make them more three-dimensional. Then I, again, am jumping around. Not completely finishing anything as I'm going, but just building the layers, lightening the highlights, and just continuing to make these shadows darker. So really try your best to get a good amount of contrast in your drawing. Really push the highlights and push the shadows. And then those medium tones should just blend out together for you. I'm going in with that blending stump every once in a while just to smooth areas out, smooth them together. Again, my piece is upside down for a while, so when I do flip it back to normal, there might be areas that jump out to me that are a little bit different or stand out that I didn't notice before. So here I'm flipping it back, just really double checking those proportions, making sure everything is finalized. And then I'm going to start to think about the background. Now we are going to be adding some background techniques in a bit, so you don't have to completely fill everything in, but look at the areas of shadow in the background. Where can you fill in some lines and value change to create just a little bit of color versus just, or a little bit of value versus just the gray background. So I'm just adding a few lines kind of coming off of my background here, a few vertical and horizontal lines to create some space and depth in it. And then there is the finished piece. And I also wanted to show this one that has only hatching to show how you can really emphasize form and do something different with your final project if you wanted to do just hatching or cross hatching versus the blending in the background too. So this is on white paper, so there's no white pencil or no white charcoal, but you can kind of get the idea of how these lines should be following the curve or the form of your objects. So the top of this cup comes down a little bit like this, and I'm just following that curve with each of these lines. And then same thing with the boots here, I'm following the curve of each of these folds, and that's going to help to create more of that dimension in your project.